If you were there in 1960, if you stood in those long theater lines to see Spartacus on the big screen, you remember the power of that arena scene. The clash of swords, the roar of the crowd, Kirk Douglas's face, fierce and unbreakable. What you didn't know, what none of us knew back then, was what it cost to create that moment. Behind the grandeur of that Technicolor epic, inside the walls of Universal Studios, a different kind of battle was taking place. Kirk Douglas had made a decision that would put lives at risk, terrify his colleagues, and reveal something dark about the man behind the legend. The cameras captured a hero, but the crew saw something else entirely. And for 60 years, most of them stayed silent about what really happened on that set. Before we continue with this story, if you enjoy discovering the hidden truths behind Hollywood's golden age, please subscribe to our channel. We bring you the untold stories that shaped cinema history. The year was 1960, and Hollywood was in the midst of creating what would become one of the most ambitious historical epics ever filmed. Spartacus wasn't just another movie. It was a statement of a rebellion against the studio system itself. And at its center stood Kirk Douglas, not just as the star, but as the executive producer who controlled every aspect of the production. He had fought for this project, invested his own money, staked his reputation on it. For Kirk, Spartacus wasn't just a role. It was personal. It was everything he had dreamed of since his childhood in Amsterdam, New York, where he grew up as Isser Danielovich, the son of illiterate Russian immigrants who could barely afford to feed their 7 children. That boy who sold snacks at burlesque shows to help his family survive had clawed his way to the top of Hollywood, and now he was creating his masterpiece. The gladiator training sequences were scheduled to begin in late spring, when the California heat would be at its most intense. These weren't simple fight scenes. They required months of preparation, specialized choreography, and an army of stunt coordinators who had worked on everything from Ben-Hur to the Vikings. The fights had to look authentic, brutal, convincing. They had to transport audiences back to ancient Rome, to make them believe that these men were truly fighting for their lives in the arena. Kirk Douglas understood this better than anyone. He had always been known for his physical commitment to roles, doing stunts that other actors would gladly hand off to doubles. In Champion, he had taken real punches. In the Vikings, he had climbed actual ship masts in freezing Norwegian waters. Physical authenticity was his trademark, his way of separating himself from the pretty boys who relied solely on looks. But Spartacus demanded something more. The character wasn't just a warrior. He was a symbol of resistance, a man who refused to be broken no matter what Rome threw at him. Kirk felt that deeply, perhaps too deeply. As rehearsals began, the stunt team noticed something unusual about Kirk's approach. Most actors, even the dedicated ones, maintained a certain distance from the violence they portrayed. They understood it was choreography, dance with weapons, carefully planned movements designed to look dangerous while keeping everyone safe. Kirk seemed to reject that distance. When he gripped the wooden practice sword for the first time, there was an intensity in his eyes that made the coordinator pause. It wasn't the look of an actor preparing for a scene. It was something else. The first few days went smoothly enough. Kirk worked tirelessly, training for hours beyond what the schedule required. He would arrive before dawn and stay long after the other actors had left for the day. His dedication impressed everyone. Here was a major star, a man who could have demanded comfort and convenience, instead pushing himself harder than anyone else on set. The younger actors looked up to him, inspired by his work ethic. The crew admired his commitment. But as the training intensified, as the movements became more complex and the choreography more demanding, something began to shift. It started with small things. Kirk would improvise during rehearsals, adding moves that weren't in the choreography, strikes that came faster and harder than planned. The stunt coordinator would gently redirect him, remind him of the safety protocols, the importance of staying within the established patterns so that everyone knew what to expect. Kirk would nod, agree, and then in the next run-through, he would do it again. His improvisations weren't random. They were skilled, precise, the work of someone who had genuinely mastered the techniques. But they were dangerous because they were unpredictable. The other performers didn't know when Kirk might deviate from the plan, which meant they couldn't protect themselves properly. The stunt doubles began to grow concerned. These were men who had worked with everyone from Errol Flynn to Burt Lancaster, professionals who understood risk and knew how to manage it. They had never seen anything quite like what was happening with Kirk Douglas. One stuntman, a veteran who had been in the industry since the silent film era, pulled the coordinator aside after a particularly intense rehearsal. His concern wasn't about Kirk's skill. The man could fight, there was no question about that. His concern was about Kirk's state of mind. During the sparring sessions, Kirk's face would transform. The charming smile that had won over millions of moviegoers would disappear, replaced by something harder, colder. His jaw would set in that famous cleft-chin determination, but his eyes would take on a quality that made people uncomfortable. He wasn't pretending to be a gladiator. He was becoming one. Stanley Kubrick, the brilliant 30-year-old director brought in after Kirk had fired the original director, began to notice something unusual about Kirk's behavior during the fight scenes. Even Kubrick, famous for his demanding nature and endless retakes, could see that what Kirk was accessing went beyond method acting. It was as if the boundaries between actor and character had dissolved. The crew noticed Kirk's transformation. His breathing would change during fight scenes, becoming deeper and more controlled like a trained fighter. He would stay in character between takes, pacing the set with coiled intensity instead of breaking to joke or relax. The assistant director, who had worked with Kirk on previous films and considered him a friend, admitted he was starting to feel uneasy. This wasn't the Kirk Douglas he knew. Then came the incident that everyone remembered, the moment that would be discussed in hushed tones for decades afterward. It happened during a particularly complex sequence where Spartacus was supposed to be training with a veteran gladiator, learning the techniques that would eventually help him lead the slave rebellion. The scene required precise timing, a series of exchanges where the two fighters would demonstrate different attack and defense patterns. Kirk's partner for this sequence was one of the top stunt performers in Hollywood, a man who had doubled for leading actors in dozens of action films. He knew his craft, understood timing, and most importantly, he understood safety. They had rehearsed the sequence a dozen times. Everyone knew their marks, the camera angles were set, the lighting was perfect. Kubrick called for action, and the scene began. The first exchanges went exactly as planned, the wooden swords clashing with that satisfying crack that would be enhanced in post-production. But then, midway through the sequence, Kirk suddenly broke from the choreography. Instead of the planned defensive move, he launched into an aggressive combination of strikes that hadn't been rehearsed. The stuntman, caught off guard, barely managed to deflect the first blow. The second caught him on the shoulder, harder than any rehearsal strike should have been. The third would have hit him square in the face if he hadn't jerked his head back at the last instant. Kubrick yelled cut. The set fell silent. Kirk stood there, breathing hard, still in his fighting stance, the wooden sword gripped tightly in his hand. The stuntman backed away, visibly shaken, rubbing his shoulder where Kirk's blow had landed. The stunt coordinator stepped forward and suggested that perhaps they should take a break, review the choreography, make sure everyone was on the same page. What happened next became one of those stories that people in the industry would reference for years whenever they discussed the fine line between dedication and danger, between artistic commitment and loss of control. Kirk Douglas turned to face the coordinator, and for a moment, the entire set seemed to hold its breath. The man standing there wasn't the charming movie star known for his gracious interactions with crew members. He wasn't the producer who had fought to make this film a reality. He was Spartacus, the slave who had been beaten and brutalized, who had learned that in the arena there was no second place, no room for hesitation. And Spartacus didn't take direction from anyone. Kirk's voice, when he spoke, was quiet but carried across the set in the sudden silence. He asked the coordinator if he had ever fought for his life. Had he ever faced death in an arena where the crowd screamed for blood? The coordinator, taken aback by the question, started to respond that this was about safety protocols, about protecting the crew, but Kirk cut him off. This wasn't rehearsal anymore, Kirk said. This was Spartacus. This was real. And if they wanted authenticity If they wanted to capture something that audiences would remember for decades, then they needed to stop holding back, stop treating these fight scenes like dance numbers. They needed to fight. The coordinator tried a different approach, explaining that what Kirk was describing wasn't how modern filmmaking worked. They had techniques, methods that had been developed over decades to create the illusion of violence while keeping everyone safe. Stunt work was an art form in itself, requiring trust between performers, adherence to choreography, respect for safety measures. These weren't limitations. They were what made it possible to tell these stories without people actually getting hurt. But Kirk wasn't hearing it. His face had taken on that stubborn set that everyone who worked with him had learned to recognize. When Kirk Douglas decided something, when he committed to a vision, he became immovable. The standoff lasted several long, uncomfortable minutes. The entire crew watched, unsure how this would resolve. Kubrick stood by his camera, saying nothing, his face unreadable. Years later, people would speculate about what the young director was thinking in that moment. Some said he was fascinated, seeing in Kirk's intensity the exact quality he wanted to capture on film. Others believed Kubrick was calculating, weighing the risks against the potential for something extraordinary. Perhaps he was simply recognizing a fellow obsessive, someone who understood that great art sometimes required pushing past comfortable boundaries. Finally, it was Kirk who broke the silence. He turned away from the coordinator, walked back to his starting position, and called out that they should run the scene again. But this time his voice had shifted slightly. The hard edge was still there, but there was also a note of control, as if he had pulled himself back from wherever he had gone. The coordinator hesitated, then nodded to the stuntman, who reluctantly returned to his position. Kubrick called action again, and the scene resumed. This time, Kirk stayed within the choreography, his movements still intense and powerful, but controlled, predictable, safe. When Kubrick called cut, there was an audible release of tension across the set. But something had changed. The crew had seen behind the curtain, glimpsed the place where Kirk went to find Spartacus. And what they saw there had frightened them. In the days and weeks that followed, the fight scenes continued, each one executed with technical precision. Kirk never again broke from the choreography in a way that endangered anyone. But that underlying intensity never left. When the cameras rolled, when Kirk stepped into the arena, there was always that sense that he was walking a thin line, that the character had taken hold of him in a way that went beyond normal acting. The question that lingered was whether Kirk's approach was brilliant dedication or dangerous obsession. Those who defended him pointed to the results. The arena scenes in Spartacus remain some of the most powerful and authentic fight sequences ever filmed. Kirk's physical performance was extraordinary, bringing a rawness and believability that set a new standard for historical epics. Audiences could feel the desperation of a slave fighting for his life, the fury of a man who refused to be broken. Others argued that Kirk's behavior put people at risk, that his refusal to respect safety protocols created an environment where accidents were more likely to happen. The fact that no one was seriously injured was, in their view, more luck than judgment. Stunt performers couldn't fully commit when they weren't sure if Kirk would stick to the choreography. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Kirk had found in Spartacus a character that resonated with his own life story, a man who rose from nothing through sheer will and determination, who refused to be defined by his circumstances, who fought his way to freedom. When Kirk stepped into that arena, when he gripped that sword, he wasn't just acting. He was channeling every fight he had ever fought, every obstacle he had overcome, every moment when people had underestimated him. Spartacus was, in many ways, the role Kirk Douglas was born to play, and perhaps that's precisely what made it dangerous. The film that emerged from those intense months of production became a classic, one of the defining epics of Hollywood's golden age. Kirk Douglas's performance was widely praised, his physical commitment and emotional depth creating a Spartacus that felt real and human despite the larger-than-life historical setting. The arena scenes became some of the most memorable sequences in cinema history. But for those who were there, the memory was more complicated. They had seen the cost of that authenticity felt the tension on set, the fear that something might go wrong. Years later, when they gathered to reminisce, those memories would surface. The uncomfortable silences, the worried glances, the moment when Kirk confronted the coordinator and everyone wondered how it would end. The story of what happened during the Spartacus arena scenes remains one of Hollywood's most fascinating examples of the complex relationship between art and obsession, dedication and danger. It reminds us that the performances we admire on screen often come at costs we never see, that the magic of cinema sometimes requires people to venture into uncomfortable psychological territory. Kirk Douglas gave us an unforgettable Spartacus, a character that has endured for over 6 decades. But the journey to create that character revealed truths about Kirk himself, about the drives and demons that made him one of Hollywood's most compelling and controversial figures. And those who witnessed his transformation understood that great art sometimes requires its creators to walk very close to the edge, to places where the line between dedication and obsession becomes dangerously thin.